We are about to begin another episode of the Prosperident webinar series. From their unique perspective as dentistry's embezzlement experts, Prosperident's team brings you information you will not find anywhere else. Now sit back and relax while Prosperident's Amber Weber, Wendy Askins, and David Harris address the issues that are important to you.
Hello and welcome to our Prosperident Power Hour. Topic talked about today, breaking up is hard to do in any relationship, business, or personal. So today that is what we want to give you information about. I'm Amber Weber, Senior Fraud Examiner with Prosperident. I'm joined with my co-host, CEO of Prosperident, Dave Harris. And today our other presenter, Wendy Askins, our supervising examiner, is on assignment, so she will not be with us today. So this is it. This is our grand finale for our webinars until July. So we wanted to leave you guys with good information on how to break up with those people that work for you. We want to thank all of you for being such a great part of a wonderful experience, and we've really enjoyed having people participate and come to our webinars. We'd love for you to please leave us a good Google review because we always welcome feedback. So at the end of this, if you would please participate in that. An outline on what to expect today. Our webinar will be about an hour long. As usual, we always take time at the end to answer question and answers. You will receive a takeaway. We have created a termination checklist that you will receive after the webinar has been finished. You will receive that via email about 4:30 p.m. You will also get your CE credit. That is through PACE, Continuing Education. And if you're not able to stay for the entire webinar, this will be recorded and this session will be available tomorrow for you to continue to view. We want to remind you to remember that today is not a substitute for your human resource expert. You need to really make sure you know your specific state and your current situation before you make decisions to terminate or let somebody go.
Thank you, Amber, and great to be with you. And I just want to also say hello to our Canadian side of the audience. A lot of the presentation is designed primarily for US clients, but we are going to touch on the Canadian context, and a lot of the things we say will be applicable in both places. Also, I just want to mention that I see my old and very cherished friend Vic Cormier is in the audience today, so I'll just give a shout out to Vic right now. Some things are changing right now, and the big thing that's changing is this. 6 months ago, what I heard from a lot of you was we're having a tough time finding good staff. You know, unemployment is low and people have lots of options for jobs, and sometimes we're really settling as opposed to getting what we want. Right now in the US, and Canadian numbers aren't that different, the unemployment rate is 14.7%. 6 months ago, it was more like 4%. So what that means is right now there are lots of good people looking for jobs. And the implication for you is that if you have some staff where really you settled, or there's somebody who you've wanted to get rid of, but you just didn't think you can replace them, suddenly you're in the world of choice. That also means something to the people being fired. 6 months ago, if you fired somebody, most of them probably said it's not a big deal because I can more or less walk across the street, probably get more money. Now they're going to join that 14%, and being fired is going to be a much bigger problem, and we can expect these people to push back. So that means that doing it right, and that's what we're going to talk about today, is going to be important. I think you're muted, Amber. I see the lips moving and nothing coming out. Come on back. There you go.
All right. Previous webinars, we've talked about systems for smart hiring And today what we want to focus on is systems for smart firing. So a lot of people think, well, when I'm done, I'm done. I'm ready to terminate this relationship. I can tell that staff member it's no longer working out, and they can just walk out the door and it's a done. So the key thing here is realistically, you have to have a system. Why? Well, what can go wrong? Here's a perfect example of an employee who was terminated for embezzlement. After this termination had happened, this employee still had control of the practice's Facebook page. Obviously, there was some animosity towards the practice, so this employee took it into their own hands to make a post on Facebook to publicly cause problems with the office. This employee made a post about how the doctor had had chronic substance abuse problems from cocaine and methamphetamine, and his malpractice insurance had expired because of that, and the office was forced to close the doors. Furthermore, the employee went on to say, if you felt like you had been treated by this doctor while he was under the influence, please contact the dental board and file a complaint. And on a final note, this previous employee also said, if you have any future appointments, we recommend that you cancel this appointment. So this was complete public, you know, we know how viral everything goes now. This practice was impacted immensely just because the system hadn't been taken place to make sure the practice was safeguarded.
So none of this was true. This was simply a guy just getting fired and being mad and deciding, I'm going to wreck my boss's practice. And as Amber says, the opportunity was left there because the practice didn't properly lock down when they fired him.
Right. So another example is staff members who become personally involved with you. Here's a great example. This doctor had a staff member that had been sick, and the doctor offered to drive them to the local pharmacy to help the staff member out. After the staff member was let go, obviously the staff member made many claims that there was discrimination that had happened. The doctor had racial discrimination and had made sexual advances towards this staff member. And when the staff member refused, that is why they were terminated. The key here is there was no witness, and the doctor had gotten into a personal relationship and spent personal time with this patient with this staff member one-on-one, with no protection for them. It was all hearsay, but the staff member was able to make this claim.
We don't know what really happened here. There are only two people on the planet who know what happened. But the mistake that was made was that Dr. Kim put himself in a position where this kind of allegation could be made. And that just didn't need to happen. And we'll talk more specifically about that in a minute.
So the main thing is we've talked about smart hiring and why you need to have that pre-screening process in place. The same goes after that employee has entered your door. It's still a system. Your human resources system goes on forever. So you need to make sure you have those building blocks in place, whether it's a good experience or not. So, you know, one key thing, you need to make sure you have a very detailed employment manual, detailed job descriptions, secured personnel files, regular honest performance reviews, and write-ups, otherwise known as progressive discipline. The reason this is key is when you go to terminate this relationship, you have that foundation built with your staff and your other team members that this is part of the standard of your office, that you have those building blocks. And when you go for that final breaking up, everything's set in place that allows you to do it in a structured, systemic way.
Why do people get fired? They really get fired for two reasons. And the first one is performance-based. So this is an employee who's not performing the way that they should. And when Amber mentioned progressive discipline, what she's really talking about is when people fail to do things that they're supposed to do, or they do things that they're not supposed to do, that they get counsel, that it gets documented, and the documentation is really important, and that the consequences of transgressing again get made clearer. So let's talk about the employee who keeps showing up late. You know, the first time they show up late, probably they just get a verbal counseling from you. The second time it happens, it should be a written warning. The third time, another written warning, and the written warning says, and if you do it again, we will terminate you, and the next time they're late, they're fired. That's what we're talking about by progressive discipline. So when we're firing employees for performance issues, it's really important that they know that they're not performing and that they realize that there will be consequences. Having said that, we never want somebody to know in advance when they're going to be fired. In other words, I shouldn't call somebody on Tuesday and say, can you please come in Thursday after work because I'm going to fire you. When people do that, and you'll see what can happen over the next couple of slides, but they may do what we call anticipatory actions. They're expecting to be fired and they're going to do some things to get in your way. And then we have people who are fired for what's called just cause. And just cause in a legal sense is really narrowly defined. And I've given you the three most common answers: dishonesty, and then the three I's, which are insolence, insubordination, and intoxication. These are all things where we can fire somebody in either country immediately with no requirement to give them any kind of warning. So normally when we fire people, it's one of these two categories. And we need to, in the case of the performance base, we need to understand that, you know, you can't just call somebody in one day and say, you know, for the last 3 years you've been screwing up and you're fired. They really need to have awareness. And a lot of the rotten things that people do to you if they're fired happen when they're fired, and it comes as a surprise to them. And the final invocation here is, don't ever fire anybody when you're angry, because you will make mistakes. If somebody, for example, shows up intoxicated at your workplace, you don't have to fire them now. What you have to do now is separate them from the situation. So you send them home, preferably not behind the wheel of their car, and you tell them they're suspended, and then that gives you the time to work out the appropriate steps to actually let somebody go. So we'll talk about those steps, and you'll see how much preparation is required to really let somebody go properly. But you can always suspend somebody. You don't need to fire anybody right now.
So referencing back to why we have to have these systems and why you need to document and have that progressive discipline, even with those systems in place, we need to think about, we've developed a relationship with the staff member, and every staff member, whether they know they're not performing their job well or they've done something that they should not have done, will still feel shock, anger, denial, and grief. And so with each stage of this, every employee is going to react differently. So we want you to be prepared that you will deal with this every time you have to break up with an employee. You know, they'll have shock because they didn't think it was coming. Even if you have documented everything, there's still going to be anger because it happened, and they're going to have some denial that it occurred and they didn't think it was going to. And then the final one is grief. They're obviously going to be sad. You know, they've had a business relationship, they've been at the practice, they felt like this was their home away from home. So be prepared when you're ready to have that final conversation with those employees. These are the 4 things you're going to deal with, even with those building blocks in place.
So in the United States, 49 states have what's called employment at will. And if you take this very literally, what it means is that you can fire somebody at any time for any reason, or in fact, for no reason. And in the other state, which is Montana, and in Canada, the concept of employment at will does not exist. However, what I'm going to suggest to you, and it'll probably surprise a lot of people, is that really it doesn't exist in those 49 states either. This is something that far too many dentists rely on when they want to fire somebody, and it often gets them in trouble. And here's why. Employment at will is not absolute. There are a lot of exceptions to being able to terminate somebody for no reason or for no good reason. And if I'm an employee and I think I'm about to be fired or I just got fired, what I'm going to do very quickly is start looking at those exceptions and trying to see if there's one of them that I can fit into. Because if I do, then you can't fire me. So what are the exceptions? The first ones I call structure-based exceptions. If you have a written employment contract with somebody, in a lot of cases, that will supersede the general principle that employees are employees at will. So if you have a contract with somebody and if they're required, for example, to give you a certain notice period, or if there's a term to the contract, so it's a contract for 1 year, then that is no longer an employee at will. You can't, there are what are called public policy exceptions. So if somebody has made a workers' comp claim, or if they're pregnant, public policy says that you can't terminate them at will anymore. The one that hooks a lot of dentists is what's called an implied contract. And what that means is you tell somebody, you know, you've got a job for life here, or, you know, my plan is to retire when you retire, or something like that. When you give people some, it can even be verbal, some verbal indication that they have a long-term position with you, that's not employment at will anymore. There's a good faith exception. And the best example I can give you of this is, let's say that you've agreed with your office manager that if certain performance goals are met, that they're going to get a bonus at the end of the year. And then you fire them on December 15th. And if you hadn't fired them, they would get the bonus. That's a case where a court's going to see pretty quickly that you didn't act in good faith. Also, if you have an employee manual or a handbook, you need to follow whatever it says about termination. So those are good faith exceptions. And the final one is retaliation. So if somebody has made a complaint about you to, for example, the state board or the Occupational Health and Safety Administration, then at that point, you can't fire them, because doing so would constitute retaliation. So when we talk about not letting people see that the axe is about to fall on them, or not giving them a specific timing, this is why. If I think today on Wednesday that I'm going to be fired on Friday, I'll make a complaint to OSHA. And especially right now with what's going on with COVID, you know, OSHA is tied up for months and months and months. So it's going to be a long time until they can actually deal with my complaint. And during that time, you can't fire me. If you fire somebody and they complain to OSHA the day after, the complaint still has to be dealt with, but you're not firing a whistleblower. So that's a much better position. And if none of these fit, the other place people go is they ask whether they were discriminated against, because you, even in an employment at will situation, you cannot fire somebody on a discriminatory basis. Here's the key. Every employee who gets fired thinks they've been discriminated against. Why? Because you had 12 other employees who didn't get fired and they did. People aren't necessarily terribly objective about their own performance. And when we look at what are called the protected classes, so these are some of the reasons why you cannot discriminate against somebody, and these apply to hiring, they also apply to firing. You can see the categories there. Well, a lot of the people you fire are going to be over age 40. So immediately they'll believe they have an argument that they were fired as a result of age. You can't fire somebody because of a disability, and the flavor of the month in disabilities is post-traumatic stress disorder. The thing that makes PTSD convenient for an employee to claim is that you can't really measure it. In other words, if I wanted to get a diagnosis for PTSD, I go see my doctor. I've read on the internet what the manifestations of PTSD are, and the doctor asks me, do you have trouble sleeping at night? Yes. Are you irritable? Yes. You know, I just give all the right answers and I'll walk away with a PTSD diagnosis. If you fire a male employee, they're certainly going to feel that they were singled out because of their gender, because most administrative staff in dental practices are female. If you fire a female, they might also feel that they're being discriminated against. The other thing that your employees have, if you fire them, is they have the luxury of seeing who you replace them with. So you fire a male employee and you end up just by happenstance hiring a female, and the male may think, well, you know, it was gender-based. Amber's got a really good example of what can happen when you do this.
Yes, and so this is one of those examples. If you don't write it down and have a structured system, if you do it the wrong way, we can all fall into some type of a protected class. So this is a situation where a practice was purchased from a new owner, and within the first 2 months of owning the practice, he fired 8 out of 9 dental hygienists, and those were over the age of 40. So they obviously fell into that protected class. On the other side of this coin, from August 2015 to February 2018, he replaced those hygienists with 14 employees. 13 of them were all under the age of 40. So with that knowledge of what had happened, obviously there was some issues because there was no documentation, no progressive discipline, and these 8 hygienists had no reason or prior notice of why they were terminated. So this makes us really realize we have to really prepare. If you are in a situation and you want to terminate an employee, preparation is the key. You have to make sure you have everything lined out and that these employees have been documented and they are aware and have signed off on that documentation what the issues are with their performance at their job.
So again here, we don't know what really happened. We don't know whether these hygienists who were fired were failing to meet performance targets or what. But when you look at the optics of this, it just screams discrimination. So I'll say what I said before. If I'm fired in an employment at will environment, what I start doing is looking backward and saying, okay, what argument can I make for the possibility that employment at will doesn't apply? And certainly the 8 of 9 hygienists who were let go in this situation have a really good argument that they were victims of age discrimination.
Exactly, Dave. And so that's why we want to make sure that you and your team have a great communication on what is expected of them and how they are completing that task. So when you get to that moment and you've completed these steps, you want to make sure you're ready to terminate. This does take some preparation. One of the key things is, you know, we are a dental family when we work together with each other, but loose lips definitely will sink some ships here. So you want to make sure other staff members are not aware of, you know, that person not performing their job and word is going to get around. You want to make sure you have it in writing. You have a termination letter that you're going to give this staff member that they will understand the reasons why. And as Dave mentioned earlier, always consider suspension before the termination. This allows you to continue a constructive relationship with that employee and document what the issues are and have a follow-up. The main thing is maintain dignity, do it at the end of the day, and not before the weekend. This also helps protect your practice also, to make sure that they cannot go out and cause the issues that we talked about earlier. If they have access to your Facebook or other things, make sure you have your timing is essential when you're going to complete this termination conversation with your employee. On top of having your paperwork ready, you need to have that final payment ready for that employee, so that when you're done with the conversation, everything is ready and you can hand that to them and escort them out of the practice to get their personal things, and make sure that there's someone there, yourself and another witness, doing this conversation, and that they're not left alone throughout the practice to get their stuff, even though it's at the end of the day. And here's another key important thing to take away from today. If you have started treatment on this staff member of any kind, make sure you have a plan in place to complete any treatment that's in progress for that employee, or you've got a plan in place to refer it out and it will be completed for that employee per your agreement in your office policy. And the last thing you need is an employee claiming that you did not want to finish any dental work that you had started completing on them.
The maintain dignity part is important here. What we really want to avoid with somebody is making them do what I call the walk of shame. And what that means is the employee who has to go and clean out their desk in front of 3 of their coworkers. And regardless of what they've done to you, doing that to them is kind of an extra punishment that just does not need to happen. And when employees retaliate, in some cases, it's because the employer does something like that. Speaking of retaliation, we need to think about locking down the practice. And there are a lot of facets to this. I'm going to talk about some. Amber mentioned initially that we have a termination checklist as a bonus material for today. So at 4:30 Eastern time, you'll get an email, and there's a link there where you can click and download the termination checklist. And it's much more detailed, but I'll give you some ideas here. The first thing we've got to do is stop somebody from having access to the computer system from outside. And sometimes if your IT people aren't around to help you, or this can't be set up in advance, what you need to do, as stupid as it sounds, is go to the wall and unplug your network, unplug your computers from your network, so that there's no outside connection anymore. The other thing we want to do, ideally immediately before the termination, is make sure that there's no such thing as remote access software that will allow that employee to get access to your network. This stuff used to be complicated to install, but it's now, you know, and some of the names you've probably heard, like TeamViewer or GoToMyPC or Instant Network. There are lots of softwares that somebody can install without you even knowing about it that will give them outside access. So your IT people need to have a look for that. Obviously, we need to change passwords to everything. PMS here means practice management software. This is something that really needs to be planned in advance and not something we can tackle at the time of termination. What drives me nuts is when I see practices using a non-domain email address. So if you have a website, you have a domain. If you're using, for example, an email address like the one that's shown there, and that's not a real email address, I hope I just made it up. But if somebody's using an email address like that for patient stuff, the problem is that when you fire them, you can't easily get control of that email address. In other words, that kind of belongs to them in the way that Gmail views the world. So assuming that you have a domain for yourself, all of the email addresses that are used to correspond with patients or referring doctors or specialists or whatever need to be from that domain, because then you have control over them and your IT people can change the passwords. With this one, there's no way, if the employee is the only person who has the password to this, there's no way you can get it back. So you will have patients continuing to email that person and you just can't stop it. a lot of times there's an exit interview that happens, and some important things there. And I'll mention that the people in the background are embezzlers. You can see the dollar amounts that they took. So if anybody who's on the screen looks a lot like one of your staff members, call me. If you have an exit interview, the first thing is it's good to have a witness. Preferably not a staff member. You know, it might be your spouse. It might be somebody outside, but some things will get said in this meeting, and it's good to have somebody else who's there with you. In an exit interview, normally your words are pretty scripted, and if we help somebody do this, a lot of times we will more or less write out the words that they use. And staying on script just stops you from saying something that will get you into trouble, and there's lots of potential for that. If you're going to do this face to face, what are your objectives? Are you simply telling somebody that their job has ended, or are you confronting them about something that they've done wrong? And as I think most of you know, our company Prosperident investigates embezzlement. So a lot of times with us, this exit interview is done with somebody who's stolen money from the practice. And then in that case, ideally, we'd like them to do a few things. We'd like them to admit to stealing, and we'd probably like them to fill in some of the blanks about how they did it. So we're going in with very definite objectives. The way that you get somebody to make a confession or to say a lot more than they planned is along these lines. You say, and let's use embezzlement as the example, I'm not asking you if you stole the money. I know you did. What I want to know is why you did it. And when you put it in those terms, that will put a lot of employees off balance a little bit. I mean, a lot of them are prepared to deny. But when you say to them, I know you did this, tell me why you did it, a lot of them will start spilling the beans and really end up saying a lot more than they really plan to. If an employee does make a confession to you, what you really want them to do next is put it in writing. And this is an area where you probably need some guidance, and obviously it needs to happen in advance. In other words, when you're preparing for the termination interview, you need to consider the possibility that the employee wants to make a written confession. If you're in that situation and you're our client, we have some guidelines that we give you that kind of talk you through how to do this. But a written confession is much better than a verbal one, because you can get some things in it that are a little bit tough to get in a verbal confession. For example, one of the things that we want people to say is, I knew that what I was doing was wrong. And that makes their confession much more effective. You know, if somebody says that verbally, it kind of comes down to what witnesses remember. But if they make it in writing, it's there. After somebody's been terminated, there are some really basic rules. The first one is you do not leave them alone at all in the practice. You know, if they want to go to the restroom, as awkward as it sounds, you know, you either need somebody in there with them or right outside the door. When they're packing up their stuff, you need to be watching them, and you need to take them right out to the front door where the locks are going to be changed. It's really important that they not touch the phone or the computer system. You know, if they say that they have personal files on their computer system, you tell them that you will have the IT people take them off and put them on a flash drive and send it to them, but there's no way they touch your computer system once they're told there's no job. This is important. We need to make sure they have a safe way home. As Amber mentioned, you know, people who are terminated go through a lot of emotions, and we want to make sure before they get behind the wheel of their car that, you know, they really feel okay to drive. And I suggest asking them this a couple of times. It's not because you'll get sued for letting them drive home. That's not why we're doing this. We just simply do not want them to get in a car unfit to drive and harm themselves or somebody else. So we're doing this part because it's humane. If they are not okay to drive home, pay for a taxi, get an Uber. Under no circumstance should you get in your car and drive them. And Amber showed an example of the kind of thing that can go wrong when that happens. Lots more things to do in the lockdown, and we'll talk about those, or we'll give you the termination checklist to help you understand what to do there. The big one though, the biggest one is change the locks. Everybody assumes that if they get a staff member's key back, that the staff member has no access. Well, the very best material on the planet for duplicating keys is in every one of your practices. You know, if Alginet can model a bicuspid, don't you think it can handle a key? So getting keys back doesn't do it. You need to change the locks and remove that employee's alarm code. Hopefully in your alarm system, everybody has their own individual code and you can just cancel one. If you're doing that really bad thing called the Unicode, you know, where there's one alarm code and everybody has it, you need to get rid of that code and give everybody else a new code. Unicodes are a really bad idea on a lot of levels. So if you're looking for takeaways here, one is if you have one single alarm code for everybody, it's time to get that fixed and give everybody their own code.
So we've talked about all the steps that you have to take to break up with that employee that you feel is not a good fit for your practice. But we have to remember, it's not just about that one employee, right? Now we have to deal with the staff members. And you have to remember, they have a relationship with each other. A lot of these staff members become very close and consider them their dental family. So we talked about what to expect, that shock, anger, denial, and grief. Well, these employees are going to feel that on some level. So the main thing is, what are you going to tell your staff? You want to be very clear and concise and make sure, again, kind of like the example we gave of that doctor becoming personally involved and driving his staff member to the pharmacy, you want to make sure that you don't let the emotions get the best of you and really go into detail of all the issues you had with that staff member. The other thing is you want to make sure you divide the duties that staff member was responsible for evenly among the team so that they're clear that even though that person is no longer with us, we still have to make sure things get done. And you want to also convey the message that we're looking for a replacement and we'll go through our process to find the proper fit. Like I said, many of these staff members have personal relationships. So when you let that staff member go, like for instance, towards the weekend, they're going to have a lot of communication with those other staff members. And they may come back in that Monday and have a different change in attitude or heard another side of the story. So that's one of the reasons we recommend you do not fire on the weekend. But you're going to hear a lot of shock, anger, and disbelief from team members who are still with your staff. So you need to make sure you have a clear, concise message that you're going to tell your staff on why that person is no longer with you, and don't go too in-depth into the details.
Absolutely. And always remember that, you know, if you fire Susie, your staff don't see her as the person who stole from you or whatever. They see her as the person who baked cookies and never forgot anybody's birthday. So as Amber says, their relationship with each other is different than their relationship with you, and we need to be mindful of that. Let's talk about references and giving references. And I was doing a webinar yesterday, and the webinar host said to me, you know, we were talking about this exact topic, about firing people. And the webinar host said to me yesterday, and of course, you're not allowed to say anything bad about somebody in a job reference. And I said, well, no, that's actually not how it works. The sin that you can commit if you do transgress is called defamation, and defamation takes two forms. If it's written, it's called libel, and if it's spoken, it's called slander. But let's look at what has to happen for you to commit defamation. And all of these requirements apply. In other words, you must do all of these to defame somebody. The first thing is you must make a statement that is false. the second thing is that that statement must be made to a third party. In other words, if I privately tell an employee, look, you're the stupidest employee I ever had, you know, my dog is smarter than you are. I'm not sure that's a good way to manage your employees. But if that statement is made to the employee in private, that's not defamation. Defamation requires you to tell a third party something. It also requires that you knew, or you should have known, that the statement was false. And 20 states and Canadian provinces give what's called qualified privilege. In other words, they specifically create a pathway where a former employer can give a reference to a current employer, and as long as it's not malicious, they're not able to be sued by that. So if you're in one of those 20 states, and I'm not going to list them here, or if you're in Canada, you are specifically allowed to be candid with a prospective employer. And the final requirement for defamation is that the person you defamed must have suffered harm from this. So they didn't get a job that they otherwise would have gotten, for example. So if I just tell you today that, you know, a certain employee is a moron, but you're not in a position to hire them anyway, that's not defamation. There has to be harm from it. So in order for somebody to advance a defamation claim, they got to hit all these. And the first thing that comes across from that is that the truth will set you free. So if what you say is true, it can't be defamation. If what you say is about the future, it can't be defamation. It requires a statement that is false, that you know is false. So just to keep you very clear of getting into trouble, and you can see the bar set pretty high there, but just to keep you clear, here's what I'd suggest you do. If you're giving a negative reference about somebody, what you say is, I'm going to confirm their dates of employment, and I'm only going to answer one other question. And that question is, would you rehire this person? So if somebody's calling me for a reference and they hear this from me, what they're going to say next is, okay, David, I'll play your game. Would you rehire this person? And my answer will be along the lines of, not in 100 million years. And if you hear that from a former employer and you hire that person anyway, like, you deserve whatever's going to happen to you next. The good thing about this statement is that it's a statement about what I plan to do in the future. So that's not subject to a true or false test. I mean, I'm simply saying I have no plans to hire this person, you know, and in fact, even if they were the last dental assistant on the planet, I still wouldn't hire them. I'd work with 2 hands instead of 4. You know, if you say that, nobody can sue you for that. You've simply said what you plan to do in the future. The other thing to be aware of is that it's very common for an employee who's fired to get one of their friends to call you and pretend to be getting a job reference. And what they want to find out is what you're going to say. So the best practice, as far as I'm concerned, is if somebody calls you for a job reference on a former employee, whether they were a good or a bad employee, what I would say is, actually, I'm just about to check a hygiene patient. Can I call you back in half an hour? And take down their name and what the practice is. And then, you know, of course, they'll give you the phone number. Don't call that number. Let Google find the office number for you and call that and get put through and then give the reference. And then you know who you're speaking to. I mean, when somebody gives you a phone number, you could be calling really anywhere. So if somebody says they worked for Dr. Martin Smith in Peoria, Illinois, go find that practice online, call that number, ask to speak with Dr. Smith, and you know you've got the right person. And that will shut down some of these games. I suspect we've got a lot of questions for today, so we're gonna allow some time. I do want to mention 3. I'm going to give a shout out here specifically to 3 companies that we've worked with in the past, and these all specialize in HR for dentists, and they all cover all 50 states. And they're called Bend Erickson, who are in Oregon, Cedar Solutions in Arizona, and HR for Health in California. All really good companies. And if you have if you're a practice owner, in my mind, HR is a very specialized area. There's a lot of state-specific stuff, and it's a really good idea to work with one of these groups. That's us. And if you want to reach us, the email addresses are there. Also the phone number and the website. And Amber, unless you have anything else you want to add now, why don't we tackle some of those questions?
Yeah, I think, you know, we went over some great topics. And like I said, you want to have a system and a structure. Just because you have a pre-screening process does not mean that it's, once they're signed on the dotted line and they're a member of your dental team, that it's a done deal. You have to make sure we document and thoroughly have those performance reviews. So I can start us off on some questions if you'd like, Dave.
Yeah, please.
Great. What should your employee manual say regarding termination?
Your manual should reinforce the concept that it's employment at will. If you are in one of the 49 states where you can do that, you know, it shouldn't take away from that. And a lot of the HR people say also that the employee manual should specifically state that it does not form part of your employee contract.
Okay, great. We did cover this, but let's go ahead and answer this question. Is there an age where you are age protected, you fire someone and hire someone younger?
Absolutely. And the answer varies a little bit based on where you live. So in the United States, the federal law says that age discrimination starts at age 40. In Canada, typically the rule is that you cannot age discriminate when somebody is between the ages of 18 and 65. So this has a lot of implications. Firing is definitely one of them. Another one is when you hire. You know, one of the things you can't ask somebody is how old are you, or what year were you born, or what year did you graduate from high school, because any of those things will point you towards a question that could be discriminatory. The way you have to ask the question in Canada, you have to say, are you between the ages of 18 and 65? In the US, it's phrased a little bit differently, but you know, you can't sort of try to get somebody's age when you're hiring them through the back door. Once you hire somebody, you know their age, because that's some of the information that you normally have to gather on an employee. So then you have to you know, sorry, there was something I should have said earlier, and I'll say it now. When we talk about employment at will and those exceptions, what I really meant to say there was this. You need, when you fire somebody, whether you're in an employment at will environment or not, you need a reason. Let's just accept that you need a reason to fire somebody. And if you don't have that reason and you fire somebody, then people are looking for the exceptions. So that's where the things that Amber said about progressive discipline and having those building blocks is really important. If you don't have those, you know, and if, for example, if you're trying to fire somebody on a performance-based reason, which is another way of saying they're not doing their job, then what you need is a job description that says, here's what their job is. What we rely on way too much in dentistry is the concept that everybody knows. So, you know, everybody understands that the duties of a receptionist include collecting money from patients and insurance companies. But if you don't have a job description and you're trying to fire somebody because they're not doing their job, the problem you have is you can't objectively establish what their job is. So job descriptions, performance appraisals. Another one where people run into trouble is they don't have any performance appraisal system, or even worse, they give everybody glowing appraisals. So, you know, you say in 3 consecutive appraisals that somebody's a great employee, and then you fire them.
Right.
That doesn't line up. And that's where somebody's going to say, I was discriminated against because, you know, I've had 3 great appraisals and suddenly they fired me. So we let's just accept that we need to fire somebody for a reason. Even if you are in an employment at will state and you've been told by somebody, no, you don't need any reason. Everybody who's fired is going to be able to make an argument that they fit into one of those exceptions. So let's just accept that we need a reason, and we need to design our HR system in a way that gathers that reason. Sorry, Amber, that was a long answer to a short question.
No, that was perfect. And one thing I'd like to add to that is how we talked about those emotions that will happen with the termination, that shock, you know, anger, denial, all of those. So if there is no reason, you've given this employee, you've done such a great job and great reviews, you know, it's like unplugging the Christmas tree, you know, on Christmas Eve. Nobody's prepared for that.
Good example. You know, talking about that group that fired the 8 hygienists who are over the age of 40. Let's assume that they had some good reason other than that, you know, they wanted to trade them in on newer models.
Right.
You know, there are a lot of ways you could handle this. For example, if they're not meeting performance goals, then you do the progressive discipline thing. If you really have no other way to do it, what you would do is give them a fair amount of notice and say, look, your job's going to end in 6 months. And, you know, if you happen to be in a position where you find a different job between now and then, you might want to do it. And put a little more thought into it as opposed to hanging your hat on employment at will, because that's going to get you in trouble virtually every time.
Exactly. Yeah, like we've talked, Dave, it's, at will is not a blank check, right?
Yeah, it is not a blank check. And people rely on it because they're too lazy or they're uninformed about how to set up a proper termination. And the real takeaway from today is, if you're in an employment at will place, pretend you're not. Just that simple. All right.
Here's a question. Is there a probation period after hiring?
That's very state specific, and I'm reluctant to answer that because I think I'll pick up something that doesn't apply where you live. A lot of jurisdictions allow the provision for a probationary period, but normally you have to set it up. So that's in your employee manual or your terms of employment, that some amount of time is probation. Where I live, 3 months is kind of automatically considered probation, but that's not universal.
Right. Here's a great question. Can you call the new employer and let them know the employee was terminated for cause?
That's a really bad idea. I mentioned earlier that there's this privilege. In other words, that there is the permission for a former employer to be candid with a current employer. But a lot of places limit that privilege to when it's specifically requested by the new employer. In other words, if the new employer calls you and asks you for a reference, you're allowed to be candid. If you call them, that privilege may not apply. And now you're at least in the zone where it could be defamation. So my suggestion would be, if you know, you really want to tell the new employer something, you just phone them and say, I see so-and-so is working for you. I don't remember you ever calling me and asking for a job reference. You know, you might want to, and then hang up. And probably what will happen a minute and a half later is the phone will ring and it'll be the new employer. And then your response will be, well, since you asked, here it is. But no, I do not encourage people to initiate that call.
All right. Here's another great question. Can you give somebody a written termination in an envelope rather than having a face-to-face? So have your written termination, your final pay, and employment record, and just hand it to them rather than having a face-to-face.
In a legal sense, there's nothing that requires you to have a termination meeting with somebody. I mean, there's no requirement for that anywhere. Having said that, it may be a good idea. And, you know, I understand that this is not a fun meeting for either party. And, you know, I get why, if I were a dentist, I'd want to avoid it. There are probably a couple of reasons why you should have that exit meeting. The first is, if the employee wants to vent about whatever, they get a chance to do that. And it may be a lot less destructive to you to let them blow off their steam to you than feel the need to complain to your state board, for example. The second thing is that in a lot of cases, certainly where we're involved, when you're terminating, you're trying to learn something. And you lose the chance to have the employee tell you, yeah, you know, this is how I stole your money, which surprisingly a lot of them will. So if you have information objectives, of course, you're never going to achieve them if you do a written termination. So that's a case where really talking to somebody is important. My suggestion would be you should do that where possible and show leadership. You know, have the guts to meet somebody face to face and say, you know, I'm sorry your job's ending, but here's why. And we want them to be clear on the reasons. You know, again, it's when people perceive an absence of reasons that they're looking to attack employment at will. So we want, when somebody's terminated, we want them to know why. Not destructively, not hurtfully, but we want them to know why they don't have a job anymore.
Right. Here's another great question. Why did you recommend not to terminate before the weekend?
That's one of those humane things. If you terminate somebody on a Tuesday, what they do Wednesday morning is they get up, they polish up their resume, and they start looking for work. If you terminate somebody on a Thursday and your practice isn't open Friday, what they do is they go home and drink. And the suicide rate for people who are terminated on a weekend at the end of a work week is noticeably higher than the people who are terminated at the beginning of a week. And those of you who know me have probably heard me say this. I don't care what the employee's done to you. We don't want them to harm themselves, and we don't want that on our conscience. So we try to do this in a way that will put them into constructive activity next, because that's the best thing for everybody.
Right. Can you terminate an employee who is only working 2 days a week for lack of enough work or reduction of costs? What's the best way to do that?
I'd ask that person to just re-ask their question and give where they live. That one has some geographic components, and I just want to make sure that I understand where they're coming from. Right. Actually, Amber, on second thought, the person who asked that question, if you could please ask it privately, send the question to my email. We'll tackle it there. I think this one's going to get a little bit situation specific and maybe not one that we want to do with the group.
All right.
Let me tackle one. There's a question that says, can you fire someone due to financial difficulty? What I'm not sure from that question, and this one I would like re-asked, I'm not sure if that's your financial difficulty or the employee's. So if the person who asked that question can re-ask it and just be specific as to whose financial difficulty they're asking about, that one would make it easier.
Okay. All right. I'm looking for another good one.
I see one here I'd love to take, Amber. It says, can you give an example of insubordination allowing immediate termination? Yes, I can. And yes, this has really happened. There was an employee once who took a dump on the doctor's desk. I'm not kidding. Yes, that is insubordination for immediate termination. As I said, though, about most of the things that should get people fired immediately, don't do it. Send them home, suspend them, and take the time to do the lockdown things you need to do and get it organized, and also let yourself cool off. We've all of us who are parents have heard this at one point. You know, people say, don't discipline your kids when you're angry. And I'll say exactly the same thing. Don't fire your employees when you're angry, because you will say more than you should, or you will fail to follow some steps that you should. So when somebody does something that should get them immediately fired, send them home. You are suspended until further notice. And just stop there, and then, get the HR advice you need, get the preparation done that you need, and then fire them.
Yeah. So the financial difficulty was clarified. It says due to the practice financial difficulty.
Yeah, absolutely you can. I mean, if you can't pay your staff, you can't pay your staff. Just be clear to that employee that that's the reason. Certainly if this is a current question, and it probably is related to COVID, I mean, in both countries, there are types of employment support available to people who lose their job for that reason. So, encourage them to get the government support, and assuming that this employee is a good performer. In other words, assuming that this is not a disguised way of dealing with poor performance. I mean, tell them you've been a good employee. I really hate to do this. I'll be happy to give you a good reference. And even take it further. I mean, if you know of another practice that might be able to use them, then say, look, so-and-so down the road is, I know was looking for a hygienist. Let me call him and explain that we don't have a place for you anymore, but that he might want to talk to you.
Great.
What we probably shouldn't do here is the avoidance thing, where it's really not a good employee and we're just latching on to the financial issue as a convenient way to deal with a problem. If you're in that place and the employee doesn't have any idea that they're a substandard performer, you've kind of you've not done the things that you should have done in HR terms.
Yeah, definitely. All right, so here's another great question. What happens if the person that you are terminating takes what you said in a meeting after you let them go and turns it to create a situation where they are now saying you were violent, aggressive, or discriminative when that was not the case? Is this where you feel it would be better and safer to just pass a letter across the table?
I think there always should be the termination letter. That's a permanent record. And the other thing that I'll remind you of is that normally when you do that exit interview, you should have a third person in the room with you. And that's really to refute the allegation that you became violent or whatever. As long as we have a third person there who's able to give their own independent version of events, then that shouldn't happen. So, it could be your spouse, it could be another employee. I mean, careful about a subordinate. So if you're terminating a receptionist, your office manager could be the third party. If you're terminating the office manager, I'm a little uncomfortable doing it in front of somebody who used to be their subordinate, like a receptionist. If you are terminating your office manager, the other option is somebody like your accountant, maybe a friend. I mean, clearly this person's not going to be objective, but the court system tends to believe people who testify under oath and have nothing in particular at stake.
Right. Here's an interesting one, Dave. My employee is on maternity leave for 3 months already. She may not want to come back to work as she promised because of the COVID virus. Can I terminate her?
Probably that's one of those cases where I'd talk to one of those HR people that I mentioned in a previous slide. Let me just put that slide back up in case, oops,
Right.
okay, that didn't go right. I'll just put that slide back up in case people want another look at those names. We have to be really careful with people who are pregnant because that's one of those protected discrimination classes. So I think the way I would handle it, and there's probably a better answer, but the way I would handle it is I would say to that person, you know, there's a job here for you if you want it. What you have to tell me is if you want it or not. And let them say, no, I don't want to come in because of COVID. Okay, that's fine. I accept your resignation. And at that point, it really is a resignation. Rather than say, you know, I'm terminating you because there's some possibility you may not want to come back in, that sort of looks preemptive. And if I were that person, I'd be screaming that I was discriminated against because, you know, I just had a child or something.
How about terminating over the phone with a phone call versus in writing?
People, grow some courage. Okay, be prepared to meet this person face to face and say, I'm sorry, but for various reasons, we don't need you anymore. You know, when you got into the business of owning a dental practice, in my mind, that's something that came with it. Now, if that can't happen, and there are lots of reasons why it can't happen, where I live, which is Nova Scotia, Canada, we're still locked down, and we're probably going to be for another month. So there is no face-to-face meeting here because you're really not allowed to do it. And that's a case where you know, the termination might end up happening by phone or maybe by Zoom or something. Okay, but it's not because you're scared to do it, it's because it just structurally can't happen. You are always better meeting that person face to face and having the conversation with them and doing it in a way that is the least hurtful possible and telling them, you know, here's why you don't have a job here anymore. The benefit to you of doing that is that they're far less likely to retaliate if you do that than if they get a letter in the mail from you or you do it by phone or the way I really hate to see termination is by text message. And yes, people have done it. Actually, my son, who's a high school senior, broke up with his first girlfriend by text message. And we had a long conversation with him after that. He won't do that again. But yeah, he texted her to break up, and it's just a really bad idea. So this person has worked for you, you know, for some period of time, and you've brought them into your special place, your practice. Please have the courage to meet them and tell them that there's no place for them in your practice anymore.
Yep. Okay, here's a possible question that I think a lot of practices are going to see in the future. When a staff member leaves because of the virus, and then we get the PPP loan and we put them back on payroll, and they informed us they do not want to return and continue to collect their benefits, how would you recommend we do an exit interview?
I would ask them very clearly, you know, are you intending to come back or not? Mm-hmm. And if they say not, then that's a resignation. That's not a termination. You've been totally willing to give them their job back. In fact, you really want them to come back, and you should say that. You know, if somebody feels unsafe, and let's face it, there are a lot of your staff right now who are terrified of the fact that they might catch COVID and they might pass it on to, you know, their senior citizen mom who lives with them or whatever. You know, that's a totally valid feeling. I know it interferes like hell with your business, but if somebody's in that position, then we just need to let them resign and make it clear that it's a resignation and not a termination. And you know, this whole theme today has been dealing with people who really don't want to or don't think they should be fired. When somebody doesn't want to work for you, you know, they can't at that point allege discrimination. I mean, you've asked them, do you or do you not want your job back? And they've said, no, there's no, it doesn't matter whether they're pregnant and, you know, meet 4 other categories of protected class employees. They've resigned. So if somebody wants to resign, all we need to do is make it clear that that's a resignation.
Okay. Dave, what are your recommendations if you do have someone bad-mouthing you on social media, such as our example?
All right, and we might ask a little bit of clarification as to whether that's bad-mouthing you while they're working for you or bad-mouthing you after termination. Mm-hmm. And maybe the best way to answer that is both ways. One of the things that I hope is in your employee manual is a policy about what people can and cannot say about the practice in social media. In other words, there should be a prohibition against saying something negative. So if somebody does that while they're working for you, assuming that you set the groundwork properly, that's a very good ground for termination. If it happens after the fact, that's a little bit tougher to control. And I'm really not sure how you're going to stop that. Certainly, if you are giving somebody some kind of severance payment, it's very common to ask them to sign an agreement that your lawyer prepares that contains, among other things, what's called a non-disparagement clause. So, you know, if you're giving somebody a payment of whatever, 2 months of pay or something, then you know, it's quite reasonable to ask for some things in return. So if that's the case, you know, you want their agreement that they can't do it. If you don't have that agreement, there's just really not much you can do. I mean, if they are defaming you and you saw the criteria for defamation, let's just play with fire here and put them back.
Okay.
Here are the defamation criteria. I mean, employees can defame you too. If they have, you're quite welcome to sue them. What you have to think about though before you sue somebody is, if I win, will I be able to collect? And if the answer to that is no, then suing doesn't serve a lot of purpose. Let's go back, and I'll apologize for flipping through the slides on you guys, but some of the stuff touches on some of the things we talked about. Let's go back to this guy. Was this defamation? Absolutely it was. He made a false statement. He knew it was false. And I'm very sure that this harmed Dr. William Downey. However, if Shannon Martin, who's the guy with the picture on the screen, you know, if he's kind of living hand to mouth and you sue him for $1 million and you win, you can't collect. So what that did to you was it cost you the amount that of attorney fees that it took to sue him. So I'm not sure that suing Shannon Martin would accomplish much. But if somebody is disparaging you and it is false, then it probably meets the criteria for defamation.
What if an employee has done wrong and realizes it and does not come in for the face-to-face meeting?
You can't make them come in. you know, you really have no basis to command them to appear in front of you. And if they don't want to come, they don't want to come. My real point is, I know that a lot of the audience would love to find some excuse not to have that face-to-face meeting. If it doesn't happen, that should be because they choose for it not to happen, not you. That's really the message. You need to be prepared to do that. And to me, that's just a basic part of the leadership that comes with the leadership requirement that comes with owning a practice.
Here's another question that relates to that. If you have attempted to reach an employee by phone, text, or email and they haven't responded, do you recommend sending them a letter that they contact you, or do you just terminate them via a letter in the mail?
I would send them a letter first asking them to contact you. And whenever I give a letter like that, I encourage people to give a deadline. So, you know, please contact me within X days. This should go by certified mail, which means that you can confirm that they received it. Please contact me within X days. You know, wait X days plus a couple. And if you haven't heard back, then send a termination letter and say, as I have not heard from you, as per my previous correspondence, please be advised that your employment has ended. That's kind of how I'd handle that.
Okay.
But, you know, with anything we do here, we want to be able to show third parties that we had an open mind. You know, maybe the reason you haven't heard from this person is, you know, they got hit by a car and they're in the hospital. I mean, hopefully there's somebody in their life who will realize that they have a job somewhere and they need to let the employer know this, but maybe not. Amber mentioned one thing, and I'll, let me see if I can find the right slide. Was the suspension termination? Let me see where that was. This one, yeah. I just want to explain this point here. So what we're talking about is this. Let's say that, for example, you have money missing from the front desk. And you go to the receptionist who has the custody of this, and you say, rather than fire them outright, what you say is, there's money missing that you had custody of. We never say that this employee stole it. We simply say that there's money missing that that person was in charge of. And I'm going to suspend you for 48 hours. And if you are able to explain the missing money within 48 hours to my satisfaction, I will reinstate you and pay you for the time you were on suspension. If you can't explain it, then you're terminated. That's what a suspension termination means. And the real point of doing this is optics. What we're trying to do is show that, not really the employee, because, you know, they took the money, they took the money. But if they later scream that you fired them and it was discriminatory, what you want to be able to say is, no, I told you why you were going to be let go, and I gave you a chance to explain, and either you didn't, or you know, your explanation was implausible. You know, because if their explanation starts with, well, when the alien ship sucked me up into it, you know, I had your money with me, and then when they put me back down on Earth, it was gone. You know, if you get that kind of explanation, then, well, nobody's going to believe it. But you have given them a chance to explain. And that always looks better if some objective third party, like a judge, is looking at this and saying, okay, I'm trying to decide if this was a discriminatory firing or if it was a legitimate termination. So that's what suspension termination is about, and that goes to the answer to that question, I think.
Okay. What if you do not hire back a part-time employee that you have laid off because of the virus? What do you have to document that?
Employment at will says you don't. But you've heard our theme, which is that it's better to have a reason. And if the reason is economics, I mean, that's a there's nothing wrong with that reason, as long as it's not discriminatory, as long as you're not bringing somebody back because they're a member of a visible minority or whatever. So it's important to me that this person know that they're not being brought back because, the practice had to downsize because, of costs incurred due to COVID. Let's let the person know why. If they're a good performer and you just can't bring them back, let's tell them that.
Okay.
I see one I'll take here, and somebody asked, how does a person know that he or she is being embezzled if everything looks normal? That's really a little outside of our topic today. What I will mention to that person is that we did a previous session, a previous webinar where we covered that exact topic. All of our webinars are on our website. So if you go to our website, there's one of the menu items called Prosperident in the News. And the first drop-down item is called Prosperident Power Hour. These webinars are called Power Hour. So if you go there, you have to do a couple of clicks, but you can see all of our former webinars. And there's one specifically on embezzlement, and I'd encourage that person to have a look there, and they should get the answers. If not, feel free to email us. I see another one I'll take. Oh, go ahead, Amber, sorry.
Okay. If you're firing, for instance, the front desk, can you do it immediately, or do you recommend giving them a 2-week notice?
I guess it depends why you're terminating them. If, it's the 3 I's, insubordination, insolence, intoxication, that kind of thing, I wouldn't give somebody notice. If it's, if it's an economic issue or, kind of a performance issue, generally, I think giving them notice is better. If we're talking a U.S. employment at will state, if it's a Canadian practice, unless you're firing them for what's narrowly called just cause, you have to give notice. There's just no other choice. If it's a U.S. practice, then, if you can give notice, you should. If it's something really egregious like embezzlement or, the hygienist who uses the same Profi cup all day, no, you need to remove them from the practice. So that shouldn't be noticed. So it depends why.
Okay, great.
I'll take the one. There's a question here that says, what if we have employees at home with school-age children and not working or only working part-time? So I think what this person's saying is that some of their staff right now have to be home doing childcare and can't work. And this person says, we need staff now, not at the end of the school year. How do we handle it? And the answer to that is one we've given before. You ask these employees if they want to come into work, and if they can't, that's a resignation. It's not you firing them. It's that, you have a job and your practice has been cleared in your jurisdiction to resume, and they can't they can't meet the call. Obviously, if you can accommodate them, you should try. Can we job share? Is there some work they can do from home? Whatever. If that's not workable, and it sometimes isn't. I mean, if you're a hygienist, working from home is not really an option. If you're a recall coordinator, it probably is. I would try to accommodate them first. If that can't be done, then it's not you firing them. They just can't do the job.
Exactly. Dave, one of our viewers, Janice Keller, said that she wanted to let everybody know that in your policy manual, rather than saying a probationary period, a lot of times it's better to word it as a training period for that first 90 days. because if you use the word probationary period or you're on a 90-day probation, that once that 90 days is over, employees will think that their job is 100% secure.
Thanks, Jan. What a great suggestion. You know, Jan is a friend of ours, and we mentioned her in an earlier session as well. And yeah, she's a practice management consultant and a great resource. You can find her, Jan, if you have a chance, why don't you just message us with your website or your email address so people can contact you. If you don't get that and you want to talk to Jan, you can do it through, I know, through the Academy of Dental Management Consultants website. We've had a couple of questions about Prosperident and where we live and where we work. We are a binational company, so our head office is in Halifax, Canada, and that's where I'm speaking with you today. And I see a few of my friends from locally, and I mentioned Vic Cormier, who lives about a 3-hour drive from me, and I also see my friend Ellen Drysdale on. Well, thanks, Jan. It says www.janelleraassoc. I think I can make that public, can't I? Let me just do that. So that everybody can see her website. Yeah, thanks, Jan. Anyway, our head office is in Halifax, which is on the east coast of Canada, and we have a total of 5 people who work here. Most of the rest of our team live in the U.S., and Amber, my co-host today, is speaking to us from Texas, from her beautiful ranch. Our people are all over the continent, but we work in both countries. So if you're a Canadian dentist and you have embezzlement issues, we can help you. If you're a U.S. dentist, we can also help you. Whoops. Okay, Jan's given a couple of email or a couple of websites now. So I'm not absolutely sure which one works, but I'm just going to put them both out, and you can try them and see if you get lucky. Okay, I'll put those both out. There's a great question here. How much harder is it for employees who've been terminated for cause to find new employment? I'm going to give you an answer that's a little bit unsatisfactory. Okay, Jan, stop it now. She keeps giving us new ones. All right. I'm sorry you don't know what your website is, but people are just going to have to figure it out. Lost my train of thought there.
We were talking about difficult it is for people to find new employment after they've been terminated.
Thank you, Amber, for rescuing me. Yeah, the sad answer to that is it's a lot easier than it should be. A lot of dentists, when they hire, do a really miserable job of checking people's backgrounds before they hire them. And we see a lot in our work of what we call serial embezzlers. And these are people who steal in one practice and get caught and get fired, and 2 weeks later they're working across the street. One of our previous sessions was on hiring. And again, I'd have a look at that webinar. We talk a lot about what you should do to background check people before you hire them. A lot of dentists don't do really important things like check with former employers. So there are people who get hired who shouldn't. It should be really hard for somebody who's terminated for cause to get another job. Sadly, some of you guys are lax at hiring, and that gives these people a toehold that they should just never have.
Mm-hmm. Yep. Dave, what is the best way to start the process to terminate the office bully? And how do you recommend responding to other employees when they come to address how that employee is bullying them?
Let's go back to one of our cornerstones, which is policy. I'm hoping that your employment manual talks about bullying specifically and makes it clear that it's not acceptable. You know, the problem with not having that in your manual is that now you're in the realm of subjective. If it's in the manual, then, you know, when somebody complains about this person bullying them, you're going to listen to the complainant and understand what they're unhappy about, and you're going to talk to the person who's been accused of being a bully, because let's be cognizant that there are two sides to the story. And you know, tell them that you know, I'm not sure what happened here because there are two sides to this story, but I want to let you know that you know, bullying staff in whatever form that takes is not acceptable and not something we'll tolerate. When the second or the third employee comes forward to complain, now you have to be convinced that there's something to it, and you start the progressive discipline process. So it all comes back to having the right foundation. And when you don't have that, you get put in some situations of bad choices. You know, the front desk person who is not collecting co-pays is in a lot worse position when their job description says collect the money. Okay, when you don't have that in their job description, then it's a little bit harder for you to say, well, you're not doing your job, because the first thing they're going to say is, show me where it's written down what my job is.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
All right.
Just like we were, blocks are very key. Pre-screening ends after they enter the door. Suspension, Dave, could that be sending an employee home without pay?
Normally it is.
Okay.
Usually what happens is if they're reinstated later, I mean, the labor laws require them to be paid for the time they were there. So, you know, if somebody shows up in the morning and you send them right home, a lot of jurisdictions provide for a minimum amount of pay for that appearance. So, you know, where I live, if somebody shows up, they're entitled to 3 hours of pay. So you send them home, they're going to get paid for that 3 hours. Are they going to get paid for tomorrow when they're on suspension? Probably not. When you do that, it's a call you need to make to your HR advisor to make sure that you're conforming to the law where you live. But in general, the idea is that suspension is unpaid. In a lot of cases, if you reinstate them later, you'll pay them retroactively. But if they end up being fired as opposed to reinstated, then no, they shouldn't. They shouldn't be paid for it.
How do you handle when you give a staff member notice that we mentioned, you know, like write-ups, progressive discipline of concerns? Are you concerned of what they could say or do over the time while continuing to work in your practice? I can answer that.
Not if they have any brains at all and want their job. No. You know, when you follow that progressive discipline, you know, and normally the way the progressive discipline works is when somebody gets their third warning, there isn't going to be a fourth, and you've told them that. If you've told somebody that and they step out of line, you know, if they're thinking after doing that they're still going to have a job, they're just deluded.
Right.
You know, if somebody who's gotten that third warning is not on their very best behavior, they really don't want the job. So, yeah. Amber, I see we're at, or we're slightly over our time limit.
Okay.
Why don't we? I'll take one more question, and I see one I want to take, and then we'll take our final bow and thank everybody for joining us for the past 6 weeks. This has been a lot of fun and a great experience for us. I really want to thank my co-hosts, Amber, who's with us, and our other co-host, Wendy Askins, who's on assignment today. They've been a lot of help, and some of the Prosperident people behind the scenes. I'm thinking particularly of our colleague Debbie Long, who's spent a lot of time with us helping us put these things together. And I certainly want to thank her, but there are lots of other people here as well who have had a hand. The final question I'll take is from my friend Allison Williams. Hi, Allison. And her question is, how should we deal with people who are intoxicated on the job? And I think the answer to that one's a pretty short one. Send them home now. You know, do we suspend them or terminate them or simply warn them? Depends on the situation. You know, if it clearly is a one-off thing and there's no evidence of you know, a bigger problem. Depends. You know, I tend to be a forgiving person, and if nobody got hurt, you know, and we understand why it happened, maybe we just give them the most stern of warnings we could imagine. But I think society is a lot less tolerant of that than it once was. When, you know, when I started work in the 80s, I mean, you know, a lot of people would go out and have a couple of beers at lunch. And I think society's attitudes on that have changed a lot. If any of you have ever watched the TV show Mad Men, you know, you can see from the 60s to now how much our thinking has changed about that. So to me, it's probably a firing offense, but I want to understand why. Ladies and gentlemen, again, thank you for sharing time with us. We've had a great time over these 6 weeks. We're planning on reviving this in the summer. We know most of you are getting back to work now or thinking about it, and you know, we think that we've probably done what we can here, and it's time for us to move on. And this, I can tell you, this takes a lot of time at our end. But we really appreciate having had some great audiences and some fantastic questions, and we had great ones today. So again, I'd like to thank Amber and Wendy in particular, and everybody at Prosperident. We hope that you all get back to work soon if you're not already. And thank you very much for being part of this experience with us.
Thanks, everyone, and please don't forget to leave us a good Google review. So we look forward to seeing you again next time.
Yes, we'd love it if you do that. Thank you all very much. Bye-bye, and be healthy.
This concludes this episode of the Prosperident webinar series. The team will be back soon with more tools and ideas. If you have questions about this webinar, if you would like to discuss your practice with one of us, or if there is a topic you would like to see in a future webinar, we would love to hear from you. You can contact Prosperident through its website, www.prosperident.com, or by calling 888-398-2327.